The morning Margaret Ellison turned 28, her uncle sold her debt to a stranger for 40 acres of timber rights and a handshake. She found out the way she found out most things in that house. By accident. She had been carrying a pot of oatmeal from the stove when she heard her uncle's voice through the cracked kitchen window, low and businesslike, speaking to a man she couldn't see. She set the pot down slowly, careful not to scrape it against the iron rack, and listened. "The arrangement's simple," Gerald Ellison was saying. "She keeps the house, manages the books, does what needs doing. You get a housekeeper who knows land. I get clear of the Pemberton note." A pause. Then a voice she didn't recognize, older, rougher at the edges, not unkind but careful. "And she's agreed to this?" "She'll agree," Gerald said. "She doesn't have much choice." Margaret stood in the kitchen with steam rising off the oatmeal and her hands perfectly still at her sides. She was not a woman who cried easily. She hadn't cried when her mother died 3 winters ago, or when Gerald had sold her mother's furniture 2 weeks after the burial to cover what he called shared debts. She hadn't cried when he'd let her small schoolteacher's salary disappear into his accounts under the excuse of household expenses. Month after month, until she had almost nothing left that was hers. She didn't cry now either. She just listened until she understood the shape of what had happened. And then she went back to the oatmeal and stirred it until it was done. Gerald Ellison had raised Margaret after her father left when she was 9. He had done it the way some men build fences. Not out of love or even duty, but because it marked the boundary of something he owned. He was her father's younger brother, a man who wore a pleasant face in public and kept his meanness for private hours. In the town of Heron Falls, Ontario, he was known as a reasonable man. He sat on the parish board. He shook hands firmly. He had a way of explaining his decisions that made them sound inevitable, even generous. Margaret had learned to be useful to avoid being a burden, and she had learned to be invisible to avoid being a target. She had kept his house clean, kept his accounts straight, and taught school 5 days a week for 6 years. She had managed to save $43 in an envelope tucked behind the loose brick in the chimney. She had been planning, quietly, to leave by spring. But Gerald had moved faster than her plans. The man he had made the arrangement with was named Robert Callum. Robert Callum owned a farm 17 kilometers northeast of Heron Falls, out past the Bonnechere River. A working farm with cattle and a few horses and fields that had been productive once and needed more hands than one man could provide. He was 44 years old. His wife, Nora, had died 4 years earlier of a fever that took her in 8 days. He had a son, 16-year-old Thomas, who was capable and quiet and largely raised already. He had not been looking for a housekeeper. He had been in town to settle a different matter entirely when Gerald Ellison had found him at the feed store and proposed the arrangement. Margaret learned all of this not from Gerald, who gave her almost no information at all, but from her neighbor Doris Mackay, who knew everything that passed through Heron Falls and was kind enough to tell Margaret what she knew. "He's not a bad man," Doris said, standing in Margaret's doorway while Margaret folded her second dress into a canvas bag. "Robert Callum. I knew his wife. He's quiet, doesn't drink, pays his accounts." "That's a short list," Margaret said. "For a man, that's nearly perfect." Doris watched her fold. "Are you frightened?" Margaret considered the question honestly. "I don't know what I am," she said. "I think I'm too angry to be frightened yet." Doris nodded like that made sense to her. "Take the anger with you," she said. "It'll keep you warmer than fear." Robert Callum came for her on a Tuesday in late October. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the maples along the road had lost most of their leaves. He drove a dark green truck, practical and dented, with a back full of fence posts he'd picked up in town. He didn't come to the door. He waited by the truck, hat in hand, while Margaret came down the steps with her 2 bags. She had expected. She didn't know what she had expected. Someone who looked the way the arrangement felt. Someone who wouldn't quite meet her eyes. But Robert Callum looked at her directly when she approached. The way a man looks when he's been taught that looking away is a form of dishonesty. He was taller than she'd imagined, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had spent years in weather. There were lines around his eyes and a quietness about his mouth that she recognized. The quietness of someone who had learned that most things don't need to be said out loud. "Miss Ellison," he said. He didn't offer his hand, perhaps sensing she wouldn't take it yet. "Mr. Callum," she said. That was all. He took her bags and put them in the truck bed beside the fence posts, and she got in the passenger side, and they drove north out of Heron Falls without another word for a long while. The silence wasn't hostile. She noticed that. It wasn't the silence of a man who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a man who saw no point in filling air with sound for the sake of filling it. She found, strangely, that it didn't make her more anxious, it made her less. After 20 minutes on the road, he said, "I want to tell you how this came about. From my side." She looked at him. "All right. I was at the Pearson feed store. Your uncle found me there. I wasn't looking to make any arrangement. He explained your situation." He paused, eyes on the road. "He made it sound different than I think it is." "How did he make it sound?" "Like you needed a placement. Like it was your idea, mostly." "It was not my idea," Margaret said. Robert said, "I understand that now. I want you to know I have no claim on you. You're not obligated to stay. If you want to go back to Heron Falls or go somewhere else entirely, I'll drive you wherever you need to go, and that will be the end of it." She turned to look at him fully. He was still watching the road. "Then, why did you agree to it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "He told me you were about to be put out of the house, that there was a debt and you'd be left with nothing." He glanced at her briefly. "I have a farm and no one to help run it. Thomas is good with the land, but he can't do everything. I thought, if you were willing, it might suit us both, but not if you're not willing." Margaret looked out at the passing birch trees, white and bare. "What would I be doing exactly? Managing the house, keeping the accounts. Thomas tells me I'm careless with numbers. Cooking, if you don't mind it. In the spring, if you have any interest, there's work in the garden and sometimes with the animals." He paused. "You'd have your own room. The one at the end of the hall. It has a window facing east. Thomas thought you might like the light. Something about that detail. The window, the light. His son, thinking about what she might like, loosened something small and tight in her chest. "I'll try it," she said. "For now, that's all I'm asking," he said. The farm was called Callum Reach, a name Robert's grandfather had given it, because the land stretched farther than it looked from the road. The house was large and plain, 2 stories, white clapboard that needed painting on the north side. There was a red barn, and a smaller outbuilding and a stand of spruce along the western edge that broke the wind. The river was visible from the upper windows, a dark silver thread through the November fields. Thomas met her at the door. He was tall like his father, but still in the lanky, unfinished way of adolescence, with his mother's coloring. Lighter hair, gray eyes. He shook her hand seriously, as though she were a person to be taken seriously, and showed her the kitchen and the pantry, and then the room at the end of the hall, with the east-facing window. The room was clean and small, and smelled of cedar. There was a quilt on the bed, a braided rug on the floor, and a writing table beneath the window with a small lamp on it. Whoever had prepared it had made it genuinely comfortable, not merely functional. She suspected. "Thomas, is this all right?" he asked from the doorway. "It's very all right," she said. He looked relieved in the way teenagers look when they've done something correctly, but weren't sure they would. "Dad said to tell you supper's your business to manage however you want. He doesn't care what time or what you make. He just eats whatever's there." "Does he have preferences?" Thomas thought about it. "He doesn't complain about anything, but I've noticed he always finishes the soup." Margaret unpacked her 2 bags that evening, placing her books on the windowsill, and her $43 behind the loose trim around the window frame. Old habit, finding the hidden places. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the sounds of the farm. Cattle shifting in the barn, the wind spruce, the low murmur of Robert and Thomas talking somewhere below her. Ordinary sounds, nothing threatening in them. She was not safe yet, she knew that. Trust was not something she extended quickly, and she had been wrong about people before. But for the first time in months, perhaps longer, she was in a place where no one had lied to her today. She turned out the lamp and lay in the dark and listened to the farm breathe. The first weeks were careful on both sides. Margaret cooked and kept the house and worked through the account books, which were indeed careless, not dishonest, just the record-keeping of a man who thought in physical terms rather than numerical ones. She reorganized them without comment, simply doing it, and left the corrected ledger on the kitchen table one morning. Robert looked at it that evening, turning the pages, and said only, "That's better," which she understood by then was a significant thing for him to say. She learned the farm the way she learned most things, by observation and patience. She learned that the black dog who lived in the barn was named Porter, and would accept a biscuit from a stranger's hand if offered at arm's length. She learned that the cattle were Herefords, and that the calf born late in November was the one Thomas checked on each morning before school. She learned that Robert rose before light, worked until dark, ate without complaint, and spoke precisely, and only when he had something worth saying. She also learned, gradually, what the farm had been before Nora died. She learned it from small things: a curtain rod in the parlor that had never been rehung after it fell, a kitchen garden, still outlined in stones, that had gone to weeds for 4 years, a shelf of preserves, the last of Nora's, Thomas had said carefully, that no one had touched, a piano in the corner of the sitting room, badly out of tune, with a thin coat of dust on the keys. The house wasn't sad, exactly, but it had the feeling of a place that had stopped partway through something and not quite figured out how to start again. Margaret did not try to fix it all at once. She rehung the curtain rod one afternoon, because it was practical. She cleared the kitchen garden in late November, because she thought she might plant it in the spring if she stayed. She did not touch the piano or the preserves. Thomas watched her with the kitchen garden from the barn door, and eventually he came over and helped her pull the frozen weeds without being asked. They worked in silence for a while, their breath making clouds in the cold air. "She loved that garden," he said eventually. "Tell me what she grew," Margaret said. He did, not just the list, the stories, how his mother had specific opinions about tomatoes, how she grew too many zucchinis every year and gave them to the neighbors, how she had tried to grow lavender twice, and both times it hadn't taken, but she'd been planning to try a third time. Margaret listened to all of it. She asked questions. She didn't pretend to be something she wasn't, and she didn't try to be his mother, and she suspected that was Thomas. By December had started saving the interesting things that happened during his school day to tell her at supper. It was a woman named Patricia Holt who made trouble. Patricia Holt was the wife of the nearest neighbor, a man named Douglas Holt, whose property ran along the eastern edge of Callum Reach. She was a compact, well-organized woman in her mid-50s who had opinions about most things and was accustomed to expressing them. In spring and summer she had been in the habit of stopping by Callum Reach periodically. To check on Thomas, she said, or to drop off eggs, but Robert privately suspected she had been checking on the farm out of the particular interest that some people take in the misfortunes of others. She arrived on a Saturday in December, with a jar of chokecherry jam and a set of observations she did not bother to arrange diplomatically. Margaret answered the door. She had flour on her hands from the bread she was making, and her hair was tucked back plainly, and she was wearing an apron. She was, in that moment, entirely comfortable in the way of someone who has stopped performing composure because they have arrived at the real thing. Patricia Holt looked at her the way a customs officer looks at a passport. "You must be the woman Gerald Ellison arranged," she said. "I'm Margaret Ellison." Margaret said, "Would you like to come in?" Gerald Ellison is not a man I'd take a recommendation from, Patricia said, which was not an answer to the question but conveyed a great deal. She came in anyway. She sat at the kitchen table and accepted the tea. Margaret poured without being asked, and she looked around the kitchen with the careful eyes of someone taking inventory. "You've reorganized this room," she said. "I have," Margaret said. "Nora had it differently." "I know," Margaret said. "I've kept her preserves on the same shelf." That landed somewhere. Patricia's eyes went to the shelf and something shifted briefly in her expression before the briskness returned. "I want to be plain with you," Patricia said. "I'd prefer that," Margaret said. "This is an irregular arrangement. People talk. I have no way of knowing whether you're a respectable woman or a—" She paused, selecting. "An opportunist." Margaret set down her own cup. She kept her voice even, because she'd had years of practice keeping her voice even when she would have preferred not to. "I was a school teacher for 6 years in Heron Falls," she said. "I kept my uncle's house and his accounts, while he used my salary to pay his own debts. When he'd taken everything he could, he made this arrangement without asking me. I came here because I had nowhere else to go." She met Patricia's eyes. "I don't know what an opportunist is meant to take from a farm in November, but I'm not here for that." Patricia Holt looked at her for a long moment, then she picked up her tea again. "You're not easily rattled," she said. "No," Margaret said. "I'm not. Nora wasn't either." Patricia said it as though offering something carefully. "She was a good woman." "I believe she was," Margaret said. "Thomas speaks of her beautifully." They finished the tea in a silence that was less hostile than the one before it. When Patricia left, she took her chokecherry jam with her, which Margaret thought was probably meaningful in some way she'd understand later. She understood it 6 days after Christmas. There was a dinner at the Holt farm, Douglas Holt's birthday, and several families from the area were invited. Robert had not planned to attend. He mentioned it to Margaret in passing. In the flat way, he mentioned things he had already decided against. "You should go," she said. He looked at her. "You live here," she said. "These are your neighbors. You've been absent from things for 4 years. Thomas and I do fine. Thomas is 16 and wants to go," she said. "He mentioned it twice this week." Robert was quiet for a moment. "Did he?" "He's too careful of your feelings to ask." He looked at her with the particular look he had when she had said something accurate that he hadn't wanted said. It was not an unkind look. He turned and went back to the barn, and she thought that was the end of it. But that evening he came in and asked what she was planning to wear to the Holts on Saturday. She pressed her lips together so she wouldn't smile. "I have a green dress," she said. "It'll do." "All right," he said, and that was that. The Holt dinner was 20 people in a farmhouse kitchen and sitting room. Tables pulled together, and every chair in the house recruited. Margaret knew none of them except Patricia, who nodded at her across the room with something that might have been approval or might have been reserved judgment. Most people were pleasant. The men talked to Robert about cattle prices and the winter, and whether the road north of the river would be passable in February. The women talked to Margaret with the polite wariness of people assessing an unknown. She answered questions straightforwardly and asked some of her own, and did not attempt to charm anyone, which she suspected was the right approach. There was one exception. Her name was Evelyn Cross. She was the wife of a man who supplied lumber to most of the farms in the area, which meant she occupied a position of social adjacency that she had converted, over decades, into something resembling authority. She was 60, perfectly dressed for a farm dinner in a way that made the farm dinner feel like it should be dressier. And she had the manner of a woman who had decided long ago what kind of people existed in the world and was rarely interested in revising her categories. She approached Margaret near the end of the meal, when people had loosened into dessert and conversation, and she said with a pleasant smile, "You're the woman Gerald Ellison found a position for." "I'm Margaret Ellison," Margaret said. "Gerald is my uncle." "Yes." The smile did not change in warmth or temperature. A housekeeper. Is that right? I manage the house and the accounts, Margaret said. Of course. Evelyn Cross looked at her with an expression that said the distinction was not one she found meaningful. Robert must be glad to have the burden lifted. 4 years is a long time for a man to manage alone. He and Thomas managed very well, Margaret said. I've only helped organize what was already there. Still. Evelyn lowered her voice just enough to suggest she was being kind rather than indiscreet. It's an unusual arrangement. For a woman of your situation, my situation, Margaret said, arriving this way, without family recommendation. The smile again. People wonder. Margaret understood, then, exactly what Patricia Holt had been telling her during that December kitchen visit. Not that she herself would cause trouble, but that someone else might. And she'd been taking Margaret's measure to decide where she stood. She was forming a careful, neutral answer when Robert appeared beside her. She hadn't heard him come across the room. He had a way of moving that didn't announce itself, which she had come to recognize as just how he moved through the world. Without performance. Evelyn, he said. Robert. Evelyn Cross's smile adjusted. We were just getting acquainted, I heard, Robert said. A small silence. Margaret came to Callum Reach because I asked her to, he said. He said it in the same tone he used for everything. Not aggressive, not defensive, just plainly factual. The way he might say the river was running high, or the east field needed work. She's been running the house and the accounts and helping Thomas with his studies. She's been good for the farm and good for my son. He looked at Evelyn Cross without hostility, but without any particular warmth. I'd count it a kindness if people remembered that. Evelyn Cross looked between them. Her smile went through a small recalibration. Of course, she said. No one meant anything by it. Good, Robert said. And he stayed there, standing beside Margaret, while Evelyn Cross found somewhere else to be. Margaret did not look at him right away. She looked at the dessert table for a moment, composing herself, because something unexpected had happened in her chest. A sudden, warm unlocking, the feeling of a door she had been holding shut for a long time, opening just a little on its own. You didn't need to do that, she said finally. I know, he said, but thank you. He looked at her sideways, not quite a smile but the shape of one. You were handling it fine, he said. I just thought it should be said out loud. Winter settled in hard after Christmas. The river froze. The roads were difficult. They were at the farm mostly, the three of them. And Margaret found that the quiet she had first noticed on the drive from Heron Falls was not the quiet of a house that had given up. It was the quiet of a house that was finding its way back to something. Thomas started playing the piano. He asked her first, standing in the doorway of the sitting room one evening, whether she thought it would bother anyone. She said she thought it wouldn't. He sat down at the bench and played haltingly, from memory, a simple hymn his mother had taught him. It was out of tune and imperfect, and it filled the house with something that had been absent for 4 years. Robert stood in the hall doorway and listened. He didn't speak. When Thomas stopped and looked back anxiously, Robert said, "Keep going if you want to." Thomas played for an hour. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, pretending to work on the accounts. Robert sat in the hallway in a chair he'd brought from the sitting room, which was a long way around to admitting that he wanted to listen without being in the room where Nora's presence was still the strongest. Margaret let him have that. She understood that grief had its own geography, and a person had to find their own route through it. In February, a letter came from Gerald Ellison. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope and set it on the kitchen table, and looked at it for a moment before she opened it. Robert was outside. Thomas was at school. She opened it alone, which was how she had always handled Gerald's communications. Alone, because his words were the kind that required privacy to absorb. He wrote that he was glad she had settled in satisfactorily. He wrote that the Pemberton note had been cleared, which was the purpose of the arrangement from his side. He wrote that he hoped she understood he had made the best decision available to everyone concerned. He did not apologize, Gerald Ellison had never, in her lifetime of knowing him, apologized for anything, because to apologize would require acknowledging that a better choice had existed. At the bottom, as an afterthought, he wrote that he had found her $43, the envelope, behind the chimney brick, and used it against the household expenses for November. He hoped she didn't mind. Margaret read this sentence twice. Then she folded the letter, put it in the stove, and watched it catch. She stood at the stove for a while, feeling the anger move through her, clean and hot and then, gradually cooler. She thought about the $43. She thought about the 6 years of her salary and the furniture that had been her mother's, and the house she had kept while he looked respectable in town. She thought about the fact that she was standing in a kitchen that was now partly hers to manage, in a house where the accounts were straight, and the garden would be planted in spring, in a place where a 16-year-old boy saved his school stories for supper, and a quiet man had stood next to her at a party and said what needed to be said. She thought, Gerald took $43. He has no idea what he lost in the same transaction. She made tea and went back to the accounts. Spring came slowly to the Bonachere, the way it always did in that part of Ontario, not arriving so much as gradually insisting. The ice broke in early April. The fields softened. The first green appeared along the south slope of the east field. And Margaret ordered lavender seeds from the catalog because Thomas had told her his mother had wanted to try a third time, and she thought the third time should be allowed to happen. She planted the kitchen garden on a Saturday in May. Thomas working alongside her, both of them in the mud, with their knees cold and their hands dirty, and the sun finally warm enough to mean something. She had also ordered tomatoes and zucchini, more zucchini than anyone needed because she had decided that some traditions deserved continuation. Robert came out in the afternoon with coffee in mismatched mugs and stood at the edge of the garden, watching them work. Lavender, he said, looking at the small seedlings she'd set in a row. Third try, she said. He looked at the seedlings for a moment. Then he crouched down and pressed the soil more firmly around one of them with his thumb, a small adjustment, careful. Nora would have. He stopped. I know, Margaret said quietly. He stayed crouched for a moment, his hands still in the dirt. Then he stood and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and something passed between them that neither of them was ready to name yet. Something that had been building since October in the small increments of a shared life, in account books and suppers, and a party where he'd stood next to her, and in the sound of a piano relearning a hymn. You've been good for this place, he said. It was the same tone he used for the account books, the plain factual tone. But his eyes were different. This place has been good for me, she said. It was the truest thing she'd said in years. He handed her one of the mismatched mugs. His hand brushed hers, briefly, not accidental. Neither of them moved away. Thomas, 20 feet down the garden row, pretended to be very interested in the tomato seedlings, and said nothing at all, which meant he had noticed and was giving them the space to figure it out. In June, Robert asked her to stay. He asked it plainly, without decoration, the way he did everything. They were at the kitchen table after supper, Thomas having gone out to check on the cattle, and the evening light was coming through the window at an angle that made everything gold. I don't mean as a housekeeper, he said. You know that. I know, she said. I'm not good at. He paused. I'm better at showing things than saying them. I've noticed, she said. And then, because she had learned, too, that some things needed to be said out loud. I've noticed all of it, Robert. He looked at her. He had the look of a man who had expected to have to explain himself further and wasn't sure what to do with not having to. Is that a yes? He asked. That's a yes, she said. Outside, the lavender was taking. The zucchini was already overproducing. The piano had been tuned by a man from Renfrew, who came out in May, and Thomas played it most evenings now. Sometimes hymns, sometimes other things he was teaching himself. The accounts were straight. The north side of the house had been painted. The curtain rod had been rehung. Margaret Ellison had arrived at Callum Reach in October with 2 bags and $43 she hadn't known yet that her uncle had already taken. She had arrived without a choice and without certainty, into a life she hadn't arranged and a place she hadn't known. But there was something her uncle had never understood about her. Something Gerald Ellison had never once bothered to learn in all the years. She had kept his house and swallowed his arrangements and held herself straight under the weight of his casual cruelties. Margaret knew how to make a home out of whatever she was handed. And what she had been handed here. This quiet man, this careful boy, this farm with its east-facing window and its river and its garden that finally had lavender growing. This was more than she had ever thought to ask for. She was not the kind of woman who forgot where she had come from. But she was, it turned out, exactly the kind of woman who could decide what came next.